In 1944, the soon-to-be victorious Allies gathered to devise a new financial architecture for the world. Trade would be free, but capital movements would be subject to tight regulation. When money did flow across national borders, it would go from government to government.
This new financial order was to have two guardian sisters established here in Washington, D.C. The International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank. By the 1970s, however, vast sums of money were being accumulated by the oil exporters of the Middle East. With Western bankers desperate to reinvest the money as loans, the Guardian Sisters relaxed their grip. Financial globalization was reborn. The region where the bankers chose to lend the petrodollars seemed to promise the best returns. Not for the first time in financial history, it also posed the biggest risks. In 7 years, Latin America quadrupled its borrowings from foreigners to more than $315 billion. Then, in 1982, Mexico declared that it would no longer be able to service its debt. Soon, the entire continent teetered on the verge of bankruptcy. But the days had gone when investors could confidently expect their governments to send a gunboat to get their money back when foreign borrowers misbehaved. Now responsibility for such debt crises fell on the IMF and the World Bank. They didn't have gunboats, but in return for new loans, they could insist that Latin American governments adopt painful structural adjustment programs, impose fiscal discipline. To American economists, these programs all made perfect sense. But not everyone agreed. To the increasingly vocal critics of global finance, the two guardian sisters of the post-war order were being transformed into economic hitmen. They were holding a financial gun to the heads of third world governments, propping up dictators and furthering the interests of Yankee imperialism. And woe betide those who resisted the hitmen. Conspiracy theories flourished in the anti-globalization movement. According to one popular theory, two Latin American leaders, Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Omar Torrijos of Panama, were actually assassinated for resisting the demands of American imperialism.
And yet there's something about this story of a World Bank IMF plot against third world leaders that doesn't quite add up. After all, it's not as if the United States had lent that much money to Ecuador and Panama. In the 1970s, they accounted for just 0.4% of total US grants and loans. Nor were they particularly big customers for the United States. Again, less than 0.4% of total US exports. Now those just don't strike me as figures worth killing for.
To say the least, the idea of IMF-sponsored assassinations is a stretch. Nevertheless, this new phase in the story of globalization did see the emergence of a new and more plausible kind of economic hitman, armed with a financially lethal weapon, the hedge fund. The men who ran the hedge funds were far more intimidating, precisely because they didn't even need to threaten violence to get their way. And their distinctive contribution to globalization was to speed it up. Whereas the World Bank lends money to countries for periods of years, hedge funds are more likely to put their money in for just weeks, or even days. The Grand Master of the new economic hitmen was George Soros. A Hungarian Jew by birth, but educated in London and based in New York, Soros brought to global finance a brand new theory of economic behavior, that underlined the fallibility of human nature and the instability of financial markets.
Your actions will have unintended consequences, so the outcome will not correspond to your expectations. And that is the way human affairs generally work.
According to Soros's theory of reflexivity, financial markets can't possibly be perfectly efficient, much less rational, for the simple reason that prices are just the reflection of the ignorance and the biases, mostly completely irrational, of millions of investors. In Soros's eyes, markets are bound to go through cycles of boom and bust, as surely as the human temperament is prone to bouts of euphoria and despondency.